So, good morning, everyone. Good afternoon now. It's 12 o'clock, and welcome to another Jerry's Take on China. Today with the ever-present Warwick Powell. Once again, thank you, Warwick, for joining me. And what I wanted to talk to you about today specifically was perhaps, in my opinion anyway, I think the meeting that is happening right now in Australia with Premier Lee and both parties, opposition and leader and government, is perhaps the most important meeting in the last 50 years, maybe even longer. I can't think of a time when Australia has been at a more important crossroads. And I wanted to ask your opinion on this. Let's start with the obvious question, the easy one. What does Premier Lee, the Chinese premier, hope to gain by visiting Australia?
I think the main objective, Jerry, and good afternoon or good morning to you and your viewers,
Thank you.
is to, I guess, build on the incremental steps that have been taken over the last 18 months by the
Mhm.
current federal government in Australia to bring some stability and a modicum of diplomacy back to the relationship between Australia and China. Australia and China, as you know, has a many decades relationship that has, particularly since the 1970s, experienced substantial mutual benefits for
Mm.
all concerned. In recent times, of course, and this is what I guess is seared into the living memories of many people, is the rockiness of relations, particularly at a diplomatic level, that was occasioned in the late 2010s and into the early 2020s. So I think the first thing is to continue to demonstrate that the steps made by all concerned to re-establish some stability to it all is something that is welcomed and is to be built upon.
Okay. It does, to me, it all sounds very, very positive, but there's kind of a looming dark cloud. And the question that I would like to ask is, will Australia be allowed to choose trade with its major trading partner and security with its major security partner? Is this an either or situation? Can Australia be protected by the United States, which is really what is happening now with AUKUS and a few other things going on? But is that possible to have Australia in a position where it can balance both of those, or is it an either or situation?
Look, it's a bilateral relationship with trilateral characteristics, which
Yes.
makes it quite challenging for the smallest player within that configuration, and that is
Mhm.
Australia, of course. I guess the question goes to the heart of the challenges that have, from day one, really beset Australian foreign policy from the time of federation, which is 124 years ago now,
Mhm.
when Australia ostensibly became notionally an independent federation. Of course, it's been part of the Commonwealth from those times through till now, but the passage of the legislation to create the Federation of Australia back then, I guess, laid the groundwork for Australia to be able to adopt a foreign policy posture that was uh, that at least emanated from the Parliament of Australia.
Mhm.
Now, the question you asked is the question between security and prosperity in some respects, and it has been a question that has plagued Australia's relationship with China increasingly over the last 20 odd years, and that's largely because China has grown and has become a more substantial economic and geopolitical force in the world.
Mhm.
And the Americans have resisted that. And by resisting that, it has unsurprisingly sought to inveigle its sub imperial allies, its client states, and its former colonies into a new set of arrangements that seek to curtail or, at the very least, slow down and hold back China's development. Now, that puts Australia in a bit of a difficult position in the short term. The response to date over the course of the last 15 years has been the classic kick things down the road approach, hoping that time will work its magic and something will solve this particular dilemma. That's kind of worked by and large, but, and this is a big but, the evolving global geopolitical environment continues to loom large, continues to cast its shadow over the extent to which Australia can kick the can down the road successfully.
Mm.
Now, that's a contradiction, right? So Australia doesn't want to do either. Australia's material standard of living is heavily contingent upon the ongoing economic growth of China and its ability to trade with China. Australia enjoys a substantial trade surplus with China. And in fact, even during the periods of tense diplomatic relationships, trade continued to grow to such an extent that records were being met. So, so the little let's call it the greed component of this dilemma looms large. The fear component is an interesting one because the idea of security stems in part from two things that I often describe as bookending Australia's attitudes to its place in the world and how it relates to the world and vice versa. And the first one is an observation that an eminent Australian historian, David Walker, made when he explored Australia's relationships with Asia from the late 1800s to the early 1900s and described that posture as one of an anxious nation. And I think that anxiety continues to persist today. The other part of this bookshelf, if you will, the bookend, is what Alan Gingell described as a fear of abandonment. And of course, the anxiety and the fear go hand in hand. Neither of these circumstances have fundamentally changed, which means that Australia remains an anxious nation, deeply unsettled actually in terms of its relationship with Asia and China in particular, and therefore fearful that it would be abandoned by the great transatlantic protector that has acted as its shield for the past 70 years.
Mm. Yeah, it's really interesting. A lot of people don't realize this, but China and Australia opened their relationship even before the Nixon-Kissinger era. And I think a lot of people forget that Australia was the leader in that. And actually I talked to John Lander about this, quite disappointed that Nixon and Kissinger were secretly working behind their backs while Gough Whitlam was working quite openly to do this, to open up. So the relationship between the two countries is very strong. It's very, very solid. And you made a really good point there that a lot of people don't realize. And I've been published by Pearls and Irritations again today with it. What you just said there, the article that included during 2023, after COVID, after the problems with the Morrison government, after these trade restrictions, China and Australia continued to grow by 9%. Their trade grew by 9%. And Australia is the only developed nation that has a trade surplus with China. So you're right when you say that they have a contingent upon each other. China needs their resources. Australia absolutely needs China's economy, and as it's growing, so will theirs. So do you think one of the things that I've thought about with Premier Lee arriving in Australia is this: there's a lot of problems with things like lithium, particularly. Let's just use lithium as an example. Lithium is a really, really important part of the green transition, and also a massive part of what's going to be China's stance in the Belt and Road Initiative. Do you think that Australia could piggyback with China on that and become a major supplier to 150 countries? Because currently China is their number one. America is number 5, and it's only 10% of China. Taiwan is number 6, and that's only 10% of China too. Places like Hong Kong, massive amounts of trade going on with China, Hong Kong, and Australia, and Taiwan and Australia. So do you think they could jump on the back of China's BRI and become part of the new green transition, new energy? Do you think that's part of what they're doing now?
There's certainly powerful economic logic for exactly that to happen.
Mm.
Australia's trade surplus with China has principally been underpinned by the export of Australian natural resources, whether it's iron ore, coal, copper, and those sorts of things.
Yeah.
Now, as the world's economy progressively decarbonizes, and China itself is a global leader in this process, both in its own domestic energy system, but also in terms of the technologies that it's developing for renewable energy and for electrification, the demand for new natural resources, such as lithium for battery production, is going to grow. So, Australia, which has an abundance of lithium resources, is well positioned in a normal world, so to speak, a normal world of comparative advantage, to be part of these global supply chains.
Mm.
That's the way that I guess an economist would traditionally look at these sorts of things. The geopolitical environment, however, is putting some spokes into the works,
Mm-hmm.
and possibly causing frictions and bumps in the ways in which Australia could take advantage of its abundant natural resources to participate in this massive global decarbonisation / green / electrification transition. One of the concerns that I have, and I'm certainly not the only one who's expressed this concern, is that Australia's capacity to exercise sovereign decisions in relation to its natural resources and who it exports them to, and which supply chains it participates in, may be constrained by its security commitments to the United States, which sees China's ability to access these raw materials as a significant component of what they would see as the China threat.
Mm-hmm.
Should Australia lose its sovereignty in relation to both the export of these raw materials and possibly also in relation to its ability to attract the capital and the know-how to value add these raw materials on its own shores, then this would be a case of geopolitics undermining national welfare. That would be of considerable concern, I think, to people here in Australia. And it would also send signals globally to other nations with natural resources, with ambitions to develop those to raise the living standards of their own countries, to be wary of how US geopolitical interests could derail their own national economic development ambitions. I think that's where we're at the moment. Again, it's one of these crossroads that the Australian political leadership, in its best endeavours, will seek to push a little bit further into the future.
Yeah, I agree. Well, it says on the description, you're a senior fellow at the Taihe Institute, and one of your colleagues at the same place, Aina Tengen, has written an article which I found really interesting, and it went back in history. Have you seen the article talking about the change of target? It actually follows one of your articles too. So, I mean, you're right next to each other with this one. It basically says that China is the new target. Well, what happened with Japan 25 years ago. And I found that particularly interesting because it really does look like this is geopolitical rather than economical. This has got nothing at all to do with China being a threat. It's all to do with America losing its position. And Australia appears to be a pawn in this game. Is that Is that a realistic assessment?
Yeah, look, I think it is. I think to understand this, you've got to take a bit of a broad sweep of history approach. It's often easy to get caught up in the weeds of the moment, with the minutiae of diplomatic moves and who said what at what events and who
Right.
attended what. Um, all of that plays a role, but a lot of these changes are taking place against a very long backdrop of transformations in different economies across the globe, how the globe fits together and interacts, and how that feeds into notions of economic and other forms of power. When you think about the last 120, 150 years or so, what we've seen is a transition from a world economy dominated predominantly by the UK and the British Empire, the Commonwealth, to one that became dominated in large part by the United States. That transition, that passing on of the baton that took place between the First World War and the end of the Second World War, was a relatively peaceful one for those involved in passing on the baton. The British have seen the empire decline, but they have done that with a modicum of modesty, if you will, a little bit
I
of
was
British
thinking,
modesty.
how do you describe that? A modicum of good grace, yeah.
There was some grace, but I think there was some modesty in that there was an understanding. Reality is unforgiving, and the relative and then absolute decline of the British Empire was a reality that was unavoidable,
Mhm.
and the transition took place to the Americans. Now, when the British handed over the baton, so to speak, to the Americans, it did so not with not particularly happy that this was happening, but it was a reality, and it wasn't the end of the world.
Mm.
What we're staring at now is another moment where transition is taking place. So we're moving from Pax Britannica through Pax Americana into something else. Now, what I think we're moving into isn't a Pax Sinica.
No,
What we're moving into is a Pax Multipolarica or something like that.
great word.
And I'm not even sure whether that's a
It,
that's a word that has
it
any.
is now.
It sort of sounds like it has some Latin derivation,
Mm.
but I think we're seeing a systemic change where a big part of it, of course, is the rise of China, a major historical civilization from, quote, the Far East, unquote. And this transition is particularly disturbing for the West collectively and the Americans specifically. In part, it's not just a question of the economic changes that are taking place, where the United States is no longer capable of dictating all of the economic terms that shape the evolution of economies across the globe and the welfare
Mm.
of the American economy itself, in a way that it did, for example, vis-a-vis Japan 20 odd years ago. In part, I think the disquiet or displacement anxiety that is being felt now is that the transition is to something that does not have a Western liberal and Christian pedigree.
Right.
Now, saying that is possibly a controversial proposition. I'm not sure that it is, but I think in some quarters it may be seen to be. But I think that the transitional experience that's taking place, and one of the reasons why there is such a degree of anxiety, and dare I say, as a result of this anxiety, violence and hostility, is that not only are the economic circumstances changing, but that the the story, if you will, of the civilizational endpoint of Western civilization and liberalism, and to some extent Christianity, that story is actually just falling apart.
Mm.
And that is very discombobulating.
Yeah. Um, I've noticed a comment here. We have covered this on a previous show, and I don't think it's quite as brainwashed as people believe it is. I mean, we covered this before, that there was a lot less brainwashing than we thought there was. Mainstream media are convinced, or have convinced, some people that I know certainly are convinced through mainstream media, that uh, China is ready to invade Taiwan, and then from there ready to roll across and invade Australia. And that's why Australia needs to help to defend Taiwan, which, of course, we both know the absurdity of that, but that's the fact of life. You did a very, very good, and I'm going to put a link to this. You sent it to me, I think yesterday you sent me a link to Rocking the Boat in Asia Pacific, which I found there was an incredible segment of that about the mis or disinformation about China's military buildup. Do you want to just describe how that's been misrepresented? Because I think that's a very useful point for what we're doing here.
The general story that you hear these days is that the region is experiencing its most difficult, strategic, fluid, dangerous moment that we've ever confronted. And the cause of that is the rapid military build-up of the People's Liberation Army. Something along those lines. That's the broad sweep of the story. What's been normalized, of course, is the state of play that sits as the backdrop in the region. And that state of play has been in play and unfolding for the best part of 70 years. That state of play has in large part been the progressive build-up and consolidation of American military presence across Asia in terms of military bases and personnel. Now, the United States, as most of your viewers I'm sure will know, has been by far and above the largest investor or spender in defense technologies of any country in the world for the best part of the last 30 years. And in fact, its expenditure outstrips the expenditure of the next 9 countries combined. In the last 22, 23 years, the United States has spent over 16 trillion US dollars, 16 trillion US dollars in today's dollars on defense. So that's actually the backdrop. The backdrop is one in which the US has been the military dominant force in the West Pacific. And that is the context in which China, in the last 10 years of the modernization of its defense forces, is operating. So it's not a case of suddenly there's an aggressive build-up. Right? The aggressive build-up was actually what took place for 70 years up until now, in the context of a post-war Cold War environment where the US had a forward presence in Asia to project its power and its interests in the region vis-a-vis what it saw as a threat from the Soviets and also from communism generally, whether it was from China or through the DPRK and then into Vietnam. You'll recall in the 50s and 60s, the dominant propaganda trope was about the domino effect and the Reds under the bed. And that set the stage for a massive build-up by the United States and a consolidation over the last so many decades. So that's the first bit. So we've just got to understand that historical backdrop. Things that have been happening in the last few years don't happen in a vacuum. Now, given that that's taking place in the region, and let's just think about the reaction to that. What that has meant is that the United States is no longer the single preponderant military force in the region. It can't just get its way. And because of that, it has now reacted. And it began the reaction 10 odd years ago with Obama's pivot to Asia. And come 2018, with the realization that decades of trying to change China and shape China have amounted to naught, the United States has ultimately come to the view that China is a peer, not just a peer competitor, but for some in the Washington blob is a threat to the order of things in which the Americans have sat at the unquestioned and unchallenged apex. So that's the backdrop. In relation to the island of Taiwan itself, and this is probably a longer thing that we can touch on, if not today, on another occasion. The island of Taiwan has had a special status in American geopolitical and political thinking generally. Geopolitically, from the early 1940s onwards, the island has been seen to be pivotal to American geopolitical and military interests, either as a bulwark against the threat of communism, which it became in a latter day configuration, but in the earlier times, it was a launching pad to reclaim the mainland of China and to assert its position on the east side of the Eurasian continent. So the island of Taiwan was important and central to that. The evidence of that is that in the early 1940s, the State Department and the Department of Defense began drawing up plans to militarily occupy the island of Taiwan as the US began preparing for a victory over the Japanese. The debate that was taking place between those two agencies was whether or not a Chinese front was necessary to maintain some semblance of credibility. The State Department believed that it was necessary. The Department of Defense generally had the view that Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang, the KMT, was flaky and unreliable, but ultimately they agreed that a Chinese front was unavoidable. But because of the unease about the credibility and competency of the KMT, the view at the time in Washington was that when the war was over, despite the declaration at Cairo that the island of Taiwan would be returned to China, the powers that be in Washington were hatching a plan to take administrative control over the island of Taiwan and defer the full transition of sovereignty back to the ROC for as long as possible.
Right.
So the island of Taiwan has been geopolitically significant. It's significant also because the US has, since the late 1880s and well into the first half of the 1900s, seen itself as being at the forefront of a spiritual war. So this goes back to the earlier observations around that displacement anxiety and the role of Judeo-Christianity and liberalism as part of a civilizational mission that the US was charged from the heavens to carry out. And the island of Taiwan and the KMT and Chiang Kai-shek were seen to be central to the ability for the US to continue its ability to prosecute this God-ordained mission. Chiang Kai-shek and his wife became baptized Christians in the late 20s, and by the 1940s, MacArthur actually described Chiang in terms of the guy who was, quote, fighting our war, unquote. So we both had a geopolitical military dimension to all of this, but we also had what I'd call a spiritual warfare dimension to it all. Now, one thing that everybody has actually always agreed on until very recent times, where there's been some attempts at salami slicing all of this, is that the island of Taiwan has been part of the jurisdiction of one single China. What hasn't been agreed is which particular China we're talking about, either the People's Republic of China or the Republic of China. Bear in mind that the PRC and the ROC are mutually exclusive. They don't recognize each other. because if they did, then there'd be two Chinas, and neither side actually recognizes the idea of two Chinas. So there is one China, and Taiwan is a part of that one China. The ROC constitution was modified in the 1990s to bring it up to speed with contemporary practical realities by designating the island in a very particular way, which described it as amongst other things, it had a number of ways of describing it, but as the free part of China, whereas the mainland part was still part of the unfree part of the Republic of China. So Taiwan has always been a province of China, regardless of which side of the straits we look at this question from. So we reach the question today, which is this issue of the mainland, the People's Republic of China, invading, quote unquote, Taiwan. You can't invade your own country. That's the first point. So the idea of the mainland invading another part of its own country is a nonsense. The issue is what the mainland is willing to do in relation to a long-held ambition, which is to reunify all the territories of China under one sovereign jurisdiction. And one of the last remaining pieces of that, of course, is the island of Taiwan and some of the smaller islands. We've seen in the last 18 months to 2 years a display of capability by the People's Liberation Army. Firstly, after Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taipei, and more recently after Lai Yingde's speech to the Legislative Yuan after the election in Taiwan. And both of those displays of competency or capability shows that the People's Liberation Army and the PRC is more than capable of rapidly creating a protective cordon around the island. And it would see it that way because it sees the island as part of one China. So it's not invading, it's creating a protective cordon around a territory that it believes is part of a single China, over which the government in Beijing has jurisdiction. So what's Australia going to do about that? Is Australia going to participate in a military response to the People's Liberation Army cordoning off its own sovereign territory? Is it going to support the United States in a military response in that environment? Well, time will tell, I guess, Jerry. But if the thought process is that the PRC's potential to create such a cordon around the island of Taiwan presages some additional military expansion 8,000 kilometres south, well, I think you're probably in La La Land.
There's a lot of people believe it, though.
Yeah, and there are. This sense that this massive continent of Australia's is at risk of invasion goes back a long, long way. It was the Indonesians in the past who were about to invade Australia's northwest shores. Then we've had talk of Australia being swamped by Asians by way of migration. And once again, we've entered into a period where there is this deep-seated anxiety that Australian territorial sovereignty is again threatened from the north. The Japanese, of course, did get mini-subs into Sydney Harbour. So I guess in some ways you can appreciate why an Australian with a long memory might feel a little bit uncomfortable. But
of course, bombed Darwin too. I mean, this is something that a lot of people forget. There is only one country in the world that has ever invaded Australia, I mean,
Now,
America has invaded, but it's done so economically. That's a different story. Only
well,
one country's bombed Australia.
that's right. And this idea of China being a threat, the China threat narrative, it has played on these anxieties and fears that go back 150 years
Hmm.
and have been deliberately vague, because the vaguer you are, the easier it is for the victims of this narrative to join their own dots and concoct their own fears.
Hmm.
The last thing those who are drumming up these fears want to do is actually lay out any detail at all. So
Right.
we've
Yeah.
got, but if you work through this in a as logical and reasonable a way as you possibly can, and ask yourself the question: in what way is Australia's territorial sovereignty at risk from China? Well, let's think about the practicalities of it. Put aside intentions, put aside intent issues, but simply look at what would be involved in even turning such a proposition into reality.
Hmm.
Well, it's 8,000 kilometres. It's open sea. And if it wasn't open sea, it's through a number of other countries and national waters and national airspace. To feasibly work with a continent of this size and a population of the size of Australia's, you'd need millions of troops to be permanently based here to hold the line, to fight the rearguard battle as the locals respond to being invaded. Now, to put 2 or 3 million soldiers on planes and boats, it's probably something that you could see coming from a mile away. And it's
Mm.
highly unlikely to happen because the infrastructure needed to make that happen just doesn't exist. Is
Yes.
Australia's society at risk, under threat? Our way of life in Australia? Well, if Australia's way of life is under threat, then it behoves those who talk about the China threat to actually spell out what that means.
Yeah, let's identify that threat. Yeah.
What are the threats? What aspects of Australia's way of life is threatened by
Mm.
China, and in what way? And of course, they can't do it. The most significant impact that Chinese migration, for instance, has had on Australia's so called way of life is that it's introduced a diverse palate to the Australian cuisine landscape. That's its most significant impact.
It's hardly a threat. Introducing Chinese food.
Well, the greatest threat, Jerry, is super hot chili hot pot, right? And that might disrupt some sensitive stomachs around the place, but it's certainly no national security issue.
That's also true.
Right?
Okay, let's
So,
move
so
back to.
it's just a nonsense, right? It's just a
It
nonsense.
is. Yeah, I agree with you. I'm completely bemused by people who contact me and say, yeah, but they're threatening Australia. Well, can you specify that? I don't know where that threat comes from. It is simply just made up by the media. Let's move back to this visit, because that's the purpose of our conversation. Can you crystal ball for me? And I'm not asking you for exact, but what do you think? Yeah, you move in circles that I don't move in. Academics I can't even talk to or think about talking to, and people in government as well, governance. What do you think is going to be the end result of this? Because I see this as a fork in the road for Australia, choosing to either be secure or choosing to have trade, and I see them not getting much choice. What about you? What do you think?
Again, I think that Australia will uh, grab the opportunity to kick the can down the road a little bit further,
Right.
and I think the visiting delegation led by Premier Qiang will afford Australia that opportunity to kick the can down the road a little bit further.
Hmm.
It serves nobody's interests to force a choice if one doesn't need to be made. It's only in America's interest that a choice gets made.
Right.
So I would like to think that the low hanging fruit from a visit such as this would be finally clearing out some of the cobwebs on the last remnants of uh, the trade disputes.
The coal, the barley, the lobsters. Let's get lobsters back.
Look, I think lobster is actually the last main
It
one
is.
from memory, and
I think timber as well, but there is a genuine problem with timber.
yeah,
Some of the timber coming across had some either disease or some infection that wasn't in China, and they blocked it from coming in and said until this is fixed. So that's got to be resolved. But yeah, lobsters is the last of the Scott Morrison problems. I think.
that's right. And look, there was a range of anti-dumping measures that Australia actually implemented in the 2000s from 2014 onwards that actually have also been lifted, but the Australian media certainly didn't make too much noise about it, and the diplomatic Chinese also didn't make too much noise about it. It just happened. So over the course of the last 10 years, both sides have implemented a range of anti-dumping measures, and by and large, they've been lifted. Lobster is the last one. In some part, I think lobster has come in at the tail end because quite a lot of lobster has found its way to Hong Kong, and then from there, it's sort of just made its way to where it needed to go.
Yeah. Do you know there's actually I live in Zhongshan, which is not that far from Hong Kong. There is an active smuggling link from Hong Kong to here with things such as this that can't get in. And we get text messages, offering rewards for information about this. So obviously it's real. So those lobsters are still coming in.
Quell surprise.
Yes.
And in part, I think that's why lobsters is really at the tail end of this process. So look, that's one. I think finally clearing out those loose ends and cobwebs will be a concrete outcome of the visit. The second thing, and I don't know whether this will happen, but on almost every visit that Premier Li Qiang has made around the world in the last 6 months, he has announced the lifting of visa requirements for visits to China. Now, he's just done that 24 hours ago on his way to New Zealand. So it would be tremendous news for people-to-people exchange and tourism and education exchanges if that was the case for Australia. So I think that there would be quite a lot of people who would be hopeful that that would be also implemented for Australia. Look, they're all low-hanging fruit things, but they also lay some groundwork for they clear out the practical hurdles to promoting people-to-people interactions. And people-to-people interactions are probably the best ways to ensure that there is some ballast to a relationship that clearly has experienced ups and downs and is likely to continue to experience a periodic disruption from external forces.
Do you think the Albanese government deserves some credit here, or do you think this was just something that was a natural progression once they got into power and the Liberal National government was gone?
Well, I think you do have to give some credit to a conscious effort by this government to at least modify its style and its tone of communications. The current government, I think, has sought to walk a sensitive path, and time will tell the extent to which it's successful in that. It's certainly sought to hold the line, if you will, in terms of its loyalty to the American alliance. It certainly sought to hold some kind of an ideological line in relation to standing up for, quote, Australian values, unquote. But at the same time, it has chosen a particular style of engagement and a particular mode of language that is more befitting of a functional and constructive statecraft. And in many ways, when you are on the stage like this, you are only an actor fulfilling a role while you're there. And it's the ability for the actors, whilst they're on those stages, fulfilling those roles, to do them in a way that delivers confidence to the others and a predictability for your counterparts and interlocutors so
Mhm.
that you can have functional engagements. At the end of the day, I don't think that much is served other than a bit of domestic political theatre by talking about needing to prove how different Australia is from China, or make a point of uh, some values differential.
Yeah. So
Not
as the
much.
French say, "Vive la différence." It's great that we are different, and those people-to-people exchanges are fantastic. New Zealand got 15-day visa-free visits. I'm hoping Australia will get the same thing. If they do that, then family members of mine can easily just pop across here. It's much easier,
Yeah, and look,
and we can show them around and show this is not what you think it will, what
well,
you have
yeah,
been told it is.
look, in 15 days with fast trains, you could see a hell of a lot of the country,
Yeah.
and sample an incredible diverse range of cultural experiences and cuisines, and experience a place that is, of course, incredibly different to what Australia is, and
Mhm.
simply immerse yourself in an experience that hopefully enriches and from which people can learn.
Yeah.
It's as we've discussed on many occasions, Jerry. All countries are striving to provide for their people a stable, safe environment in which they can lead fulfilling and prosperous lives.
Mhm.
China is no different. Uh, and just to understand how that happens in a place with 1.4 billion people is a fascinating experience in and of itself.
Yeah.
Australia's got 27 million people. For every one Australian, there are 54 Chinese. So,
Yeah.
so you just got to appreciate that scale has its own quality, and societies that experience the need to deal with these realities will figure out ways of doing their business that are different from each other's. Australia's got other challenges. Australia's challenge is big landmass, very few people, a very
Yeah.
different set of experiences.
Yeah.
So,
Mm.
yeah, look, 15 days, I'd encourage anybody and everybody to
Yeah, it's a good
grab that
start.
if it
I,
can.
I, I often
I'd
think
like to have you anyway.
I used to work in central Sydney, and I used to think it was pretty crowded. And then I went to Guangzhou. So, wow.
I don't know whether you recall, but many years ago there was an advertisement for um, one of the oil brands, and the actor in the ad would say, "Oils ain't oils,"
Right. Yeah.
and I think you can say, "Scale ain't scale," right? And
Yeah.
until you experience population density and scale, a la China, you haven't experienced scale or population density.
Hmm. There was some talk that Australia may get some new pandas.
Yeah, America's got some pandas back too. So
Yeah. So the ABC are a little critical about this. This is China extending soft power. Everyone loves pandas. That's a fact. You go to a zoo and you see a panda, you can't help but think, "Wow, that's cute." It really is cute. The problem with Australia's pandas, apparently, they have a pair in Adelaide, but they haven't mated. They're infertile, and so they're planning to send another pair that have mated in the past, and maybe they'll get some panda babies. I think that's
yeah,
a very, very good thing for China and Australia to do.
look, the ABC needs to take a chill pill and actually be open to the possibilities that these sorts of exchanges actually contribute to mutual understanding and dialogue between
Mm.
peoples. Everybody, as you say, children, old people,
Yeah.
younger people, um, are fascinated by pandas. In fact, in 15 days, if people get to China, and there is a 15-day window, get
Go to
yourself and take
Sichuan.
them to Chengdu. Take them to Chengdu
Yeah.
and go and see the panda sanctuary there, right?
Yeah.
It's a must do because uh, these are amazing creatures that that humanity can share and appreciate. And why not? It's
Mm.
through things like this, places and people can actually develop, if not if not always great love, they can develop mutual respect and
Mm.
empathy, and they're important things to have.
What did you think about the decision by the Foreign Investment Review Board a week ago to stop Chinese investments in lithium? Do you think that was? I mean, obviously, they have Chinese company were invested in, or two Chinese companies were invested in lithium mining, and they have to sell that, and they're selling it to Americans. What's that about?
Look, part of the problem with this foreign investment regime is that the so-called national interest test is in large part arbitrary and vague.
Mm.
And so, what constitutes national interest is actually not clear at all. And it provides, I think, an excessive amount of undefined wriggle room
Yeah.
for capricious decisions to be made that suit the whims of the times. So that's, I think, the first general problem with FIRB related issues. With that said, the other issue that we've got to bear in mind is that, in fact, the greatest concerns around Chinese investments in Australia have related to the Port of Darwin. And a number of inquiries have been undertaken in relation to
Three.
that specific um, risk vector. And those inquiries have all concluded that there is no risk. So, this question of risk and national security, I think, really needs to be made a lot more transparent, because otherwise you will end up with incredibly capricious and arbitrary decisions that don't specify what the national interest is that is at
Mm.
stake, what the nature of the risks are, and more important than that, what the assessment of or evaluation of that risk is. Because you have to remember that risk analysis is actually about two related things. One is the probability of something bad happening. And secondly, what are the consequences of these bad things happening? How severe are the consequences?
Mm.
So, things that are highly probable might not be that severe, whereas there are things that are highly improbable that may be very severe. So, I
Yeah.
think there needs to be a lot more transparency if these decisions are going to be persuasive in the long run, and importantly, deliver to the global investment community a higher level of certainty about what it is that Australian policymakers are concerned about. The last thing I would say about this foreign investment question is that, and this goes back to what we touched on earlier, that in this great green transition that's taking place around the world, much of it is actually driven by the technologies and know-hows that have been developed and have matured in China over the
Mhm.
last 15 years. And the flip side of the kinds of national security risks that the FIRB processes notionally touch on is that Australia runs the risk of dealing itself out of access to the kinds of know-hows that could propel Australian industry into another sphere altogether.
I think you hit the nail on the head there. That's how I view it. What Australia may need to do is to say, okay, you're going to invest in our lithium, but in order to invest in our lithium, we want you to invest in a lithium processing plant too, and
Well,
then we can work together.
look, Indonesia, as we've discussed on a previous chat, explicitly framed its policies around its nickel
Yes.
resources to encourage the investment in downstream processing. Now, for decades, Jerry, for decades, I have heard across Australia a wish that Australia would be more than just an exporter of raw materials, that Australia would become a value adder
You added, yeah.
of its natural resources. And yet, when the opportunity arises for it to really pursue that with a gusto in lithium, it balks.
Is there a kind of fear of, maybe it's a fear of pollution? Maybe it's a fear of environmental degradation. Is that what you think might be driving those decisions? You know, it's better to export mountains of iron ore than it is to build a foundry and make your own steel.
Well, Australia has a history, of course, of its own steel, you know, with its ups and downs,
Or
closures,
Canberra, yeah.
but industry, historically, of course, when it was built over the last century, had many aspects which are incredibly polluting. Over the last 20 or 30 years, the sensibility around identifying and managing the environmental impacts of industrial development has really come to the fore. And in many regards, the regimes that Australia has to, and it's not perfect, and there'll be critics, of course, of this, you know, that it either doesn't go far enough or it goes too far. But there are reasonably strict regimes that govern the development of new industrial activities and how the environmental impacts are to be managed or mitigated. Now, if you don't have confidence in the ability of your legislative framework to deliver the outcomes that you seek from an environmental impacts management point of view, then you've got to take a really hard look at your legislative regime and the apparatuses that you have to enforce those regimes. You know, why bother having laws around environmental impact management and protection if you don't think you can use those laws effectively to achieve those outcomes?
And there is an issue, it's been raised in the questions here, that there's the not in my backyard. There's a lot of, I'll use the word protest. There's a lot of protest against anything like this happening. Is that something that's stymieing development in Australia?
Australia's a big country with not many people, and different parts of Australia and the communities in those parts of Australia relate to industrial development quite differently. There are many parts of regional Australia that I think would continue to embrace industrial development, particularly industrial development with 21st century characteristics, which are those that are well governed, that have strong and robust environmental protection regulations around them. And the places that I have in mind are places that I've had a soft spot for a long time, because I've had a lot of relationships in these parts of the world, and that is in North Queensland, for example, where there has been a long history of industrial development and a proud history of being downstream value adders and exporters of Australian raw materials and value added raw materials. Of course, the way that you would do a refinery today is not how a refinery was done 80 years ago.
True.
That speaks to logic, right? But there is no reason why you can't develop contemporary downstream processing facilities that meet the standards that a community today would expect of it, and create great jobs and contribute to the economic welfare of places. So the issue is whether that can be done cost effectively. And a part of this issue is, of course, the cost of building those refineries and the infrastructure that's needed to operate them. And a lot of this capital equipment would probably be imported from China, not just China, but other places, if they were willing to do so, because Chinese scale has enabled the development of incredibly cost competitive capital goods. The other thing is the operating expenses of a lot of these refineries. And traditionally, to do that, and they're energy intensive, you had to run baseload coal-fired power. Now, again, that's changing too. And I know that, for example, in North Queensland, a zinc refinery has been, over the last 7 or 8 years, progressively transitioning from an energy system that was entirely dependent upon traditional sources to an energy system that is renewable. And that's to run a zinc refinery, which
All right.
is incredibly electricity intensive. So modern technologies actually enable these sorts of activities to be undertaken with environmental impacts that come closer to meeting today's community expectations and operating costs that could make downstream value adding in Australia, and I say could, um, competitive.
Yeah. So one of the things that Australia does have an abundance of is land and sunshine. So it's two things that it has an abundance of, and this is where China excels. I've cycled through Gansu and Xinjiang, and you cycle past these wind farms and the solar energy farms, and you can cycle for miles, kilometers, a kilometer after kilometer. In fact, that one of the wind farms in Xinjiang is so big that it took several days to cycle through. Days. Now we're cycling nearly 100 kilometers a day. That's how long it takes to get through these things. They are so big, it's incredible. And I think Australia could do that. Now they may say, oh, but it'll ruin the land. Well, what's the land used for right now? Nothing. Four-wheel drive.
Australia,
You can still do that.
one of the really interesting things actually about the evolution of the energy system in Australia is that, despite the hurly-burly of the public debate about the green transition and the role of
Mm-hmm.
renewables and whether or not it's reliable and the need for baseload coal and things like that, is that in many parts of Australia, business and state governments in particular have actually just gotten on with things. And there's a proliferation of renewable energy generating sources in many parts of Australia. So, in some, and you've got to remember that in Australia, the energy supply system has historically been the responsibility of state governments, not the Commonwealth. So,
Right.
whilst a lot of the debates happen at a national level, folk at the state levels have just gotten on with stuff.
I know, particularly in Western Australia, that's true, isn't it?
Yeah, North
So,
Queensland as well. So North Queensland and parts of the Hunter Valley. Look, the big issue you've got with a lot of these processes is how you, as a society, deal with the disruptions caused by change.
mm,
So when you have long-standing communities and economies as a result that have been built around particular kinds of activities, and
mhm,
that those activities are no longer viable for one reason or another, then as a society, through governments and also through non-government mechanisms, you have to think about what happens next. You
mhm,
can of course abandon these communities and wish them all the best, but that's probably not something that most societies would choose to do. So the big question often that comes with these transformational possibilities is not so much whether or not these new technologies are viable, but it's how do you make the transition that enables those impacted communities to either benefit from the transition or at least have the downside mitigated. And
mhm,
much more thinking really needs to go into not just one-off compensation, but what those transitional pathways are through skills development and empowerment initiatives. And I often think of the processes that were undertaken during the 1980s and 1990s in Australia, when Australia consciously moved increasingly away from a protectionist orientation by reducing tariffs across the board. And of course, that had a big impact on a number of industries: textiles, clothing,
mm.
footwear, and other manufacturing sectors. But the Commonwealth government at the time led these processes of transformation with a range of industrial transformation plans in which training was a massive component.
Right. We've
And
got a
that's what
debate going. We've got a debate going on about beef and Australian beef, which would most of the investment would come from Hong Kong. Someone has said Australian beef is huge here in China. I live in China. I know I can go to restaurants and I can order Australian beef. I can order American beef, and
sure.
it's good stuff. There was an issue with Australian beef, but it was only with a couple of abattoirs, and I think one of them was even Chinese owned. So it wasn't that Australian beef was a problem for China. It was that a particular abattoir or a couple of particular abattoirs were leaving too much what they call veterinarian residue. They inject into the cow's neck, and then some of that medicine is still in the beef, and that was the problem. I don't think beef is an issue. I think resources, I think value adding is the thing. Beef will always be coming, beef, lobsters, barley, they will always be coming to China as long as Australia wants to sell them to China. There will be a market here for them. And wine too. Chinese people love Australian wine.
Yeah, look, the Australian wine has re-entered the China market since the removal of the anti-dumping tariffs a few months ago. And in fact, there has been a wave of Australian wine back into the China market. When you look at the data, it's quite astounding in terms of what has taken place. Now, that took quite some preparation because in the lead up to the much anticipated removal of those tariffs, many containers of Australian wine were sitting in warehouses in Hong Kong, ready to make the short journey across the border into Shenzhen and then across into the rest of the mainland market. Look, on the beef question, part of the issue goes to paperwork and labelling and documentation.
Yes.
Cross-border trade is very documentary intensive, and ensuring that the paperwork is in order is critical for the physical products to ultimately be cleared and move through customs.
Mm-hmm.
The issue is, of course, when you're dealing with an incredible amount of paperwork, and mark my words, it's still heavily paper driven, it is quite easy for the wrong bits of paper to go into the wrong folders, the bits of paper to be missing, bits of information to not be filled in correctly. And often these relatively minor oversights and errors are things that don't act as barriers to the movement of the goods because customs ultimately turns a bit of a blind eye to them. The issue arises, as it did in the case of beef, when in the aftermath of the previous Commonwealth government's comments about sending in weapons grade inspectors to China to go on a hunt for the origin of COVID, that things that were previously ignored, where the blind eye was cast, were suddenly things that could be used as a reaction. And in some part, I think that was the issue around beef. That finally, in the last month or so, has been resolved with the last set of abattoirs now having addressed those issues and are able to move back into the market. You'll also recall that when those barriers were imposed or the restrictions imposed on abattoirs, that none of the abattoirs actually jumped up and down and screamed. And the abattoir owners and operators put their heads down and worked very closely with the export authorities as well as the China side to address the issues in a very practical way. So, and I guess this goes to this issue of style, doesn't it? That, you can try to grab a headline around things that happen, or you can treat them as things that actually need to be dealt with in a practical way.
Yeah, and the media decided to headline it without telling the whole story. I think in a lot of cases, most cases, they didn't tell the whole story.
Yeah, and that has been an unfortunate feature of the landscape now for, well, it's been intensifying really for the best part of the last 15 years, but it has become particularly pronounced in the last 5.
Yeah. Are you? Let's just finish off because we're coming to the kind of
Sure.
over the hour, and we wanted to finish before the 90 minutes
Yeah.
were up. I want to have just kind of one final overview. Is the Premier Lee visit? Is it a sign of? I know you're talking about kicking the can down the road, and maybe it's just be more of the status quo. But are you overall optimistic or pessimistic about it?
About the Australia-China relationship.
Well, particularly from this, because I see this as a pivotal moment in Australia's history, really. I do. But how do you feel about it? Do you feel optimistic or pessimistic about Premier Lee's visit, Li Qiang's visit?
I think I go back to my first observation, and that is this is a bilateral relationship with trilateral characteristics.
Mm.
The quality of the relationship between Australia and China, as well as the depth of that quality and breadth of that quality, is something that is impacted by other forces. And the extent to which there is a pragmatic dimension to the engagements that have taken place over the last 18 months in particular to bring stability back to the bilateral relationship, the shadow of the third wheel remains large. And until attitudes towards China in Washington changes, Australian attitudes towards China will continue to be, in large part or to a greater extent, marked by an anxiety and a fear that has been part and parcel of Australia's attitudes to and relationships with Asia and China over the course of the last 150 years.
Mm.
So I remain optimistic on this particular score, and that is that there is sufficient economic interest for a highly pragmatic approach to be adopted by all concerned. I am concerned that the instabilities in the region that have been intensified, particularly by the US pursuing its trilateral arrangements and other forms of military alliances with a view to reasserting primacy in Asia, is causing disturbances in our neck of the woods that are counterproductive. Australia is, in parts, an exemplar of this contradiction. And it's a contradiction between the fears and the anxieties that it has, which actually comes from its unresolved relationship with its own history as a colonial settlement, and with its relationship to an Asia that it has never really felt a part of. And until those broader issues are resolved, then it will take generations for those things to not just resolve, but to evolve.
A couple of comments here about Australia's control of its own destiny. Do you think Australia is in command of its own national interests, its own national security, its own destiny? Or do you think that one of the two superpowers can actually influence what Australia does, or will influence what Australia does?
Look, often the debate, if you will, around this kind of question pits it as a question of a determinism on one side and free will on the other. You know, that or that Australia has no say, or it has, all the say. What I'll say to this is that nation states have ways of thinking about their place in the world and ways of thinking about what it is that is in their interests.
Right.
as well as thinking about what it is that they think the rest of the world looks like. And how they do that will ultimately affect what it is that they conceivably may do.
Yeah.
It's the field of the possible. And so there is no such thing as absolute agency, because all forms of agency are conditioned by the material environment in which you exist, as well as the ways in which you think about your operating environment. Now, Australia has a long history of playing, in some regards, a role made possible by its status as a sub-imperial power. And that enables Australia to have certain kinds of agency, if you will, but in a very conditional way. So it's not about being a vassal per se, though I know that there'll be people who will straight away say, no, Australia's just a vassal. Um, and
We've got a couple of those comments.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I appreciate where people like that are coming from. But I do think that the issue of vassalage, if you will, or sub-imperial alliance status is a little bit more nuanced, in that it certainly shapes and conditions and limits the kinds of ways that Australia thinks of, or the Australian political leadership thinks about what it can and can't, what it should and shouldn't do. So within those parameters, within that envelope of possibilities, Australia has agency. But largely, by and large, Australia doesn't choose that envelope.
Right. Okay. So we have a kicking the can down the road, relatively optimistic, with some aspects being slightly pessimistic discussion going on at the moment. I mean, that's the way it is with Australia right now. I'm kind of hoping, and I can't see it with the media, but I'm hoping that the business relationship will be improved. I'm certain of that. I'm quite optimistic about that. And I'm hoping that the pandas and the visas and those kinds of things, because you cannot tell a lie to someone when they've seen the truth. And I think the media wants to paint China in a picture, or paint China in a light that really isn't true. I mean, you've been to China many, many times. You're born in China, right? So you've been here enough to know that what the media says is not right. And that's really what we need to get out there.
Jerry, if I could just sort of end with a bit of an observation based on my recent trip to Beijing, which was only a week or so ago.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the main reasons why I went was to participate in an event at the Beijing Foreign Studies University to celebrate the 60th anniversary of Professor Colin McKerris's first engagement as a teacher in Beijing. Right. Now, Professor Colin McKerris is an eminent Australian who established Asian studies in the 1970s at Griffith University, and was one of my teachers and supervisors in my postgraduate work.
Right.
And going to Beijing to participate in this event, which incidentally was a mirror event to one that was held in Australia about 3 weeks prior, brought together people from China and Australia in a shared moment that reflected upon the ups and downs of the past, the last 60 years in particular, but which also gave you a sense that there was still across the social body, whether it was in academia, business, or other parts of the two societies, a level of human goodwill that always acts as a bit of a counterbalance to some of the more adverse and negative energies that are floating around. So I think that the two countries actually are incredibly complementary, certainly in economic terms.
Yep.
The two countries actually have no conflicts of interest, really, of any substance. What conflicts there are sort of historical, cultural, and ideological. but they aren't of material substance as far as the welfare of Australians are concerned or the welfare of Chinese are concerned. And the fact is that Australia remains a country that people in China hold dearly. The responses at the events that I participated in to all the Australians that were there and to all things Australian was incredibly positive, and so I think that there is a basis for us to be hopeful, if not optimistic.
That's a very, very good way to end the show, because that's exactly how I feel. It's the people to people, the academics to academics, and the business to business, because no businessman wants to say, I don't want to do business with my largest trading partner. And I think we can put the politics aside and hope that the people and the connections that our two countries have. And I consider myself more Chinese than anything now. You're the Chinese guy sitting in Australia, and I'm the Australian guy sitting in China, and we're kind of in the wrong cultural suits, aren't we? But I mean, first of all, I want to thank you for your time and for your expertise. But I particularly want to thank you for that last statement. I believe that you're right. We should hold some optimism. So on that happy note, let's leave it there, because I did promise you it would only be 90 minutes. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. Thanks, Warwick Powell. And I'm going to put a link to the TIO, the TI Observer, the Taihe Institute. There are, in this week's, is it weekly or monthly? I think
Monthly.
It's monthly, yeah. There are two really, really good articles in there that are very well worth reading, one by you and one by another guy that I've met. I wouldn't call him a friend yet, but Anna Tengen is a very, very nice guy. Did you meet him in Beijing?
Dinner with Anna. This is trade secret, but I had dinner with Anna on a couple of occasions while I was there, and had a chance to pick his brains and hopefully get a little bit more wisdom from him.
Yeah, great. He's a lovely guy and very, very smart. I was fortunate enough just to meet him once when I was in Beijing for another event with Xinhua TV, and I'm the kind of little guy there. I mean, really, these guys are huge personalities. It's great to meet him. And thank you very much, everyone. And Donut, thank you. Donut Wu has just joined in and given me one of these super stickers. So thank you very much. And that brings us to the end of today's little chat, but a lot of great information. Thank you so much, Warwick, for everything that you do for China, for us, and for me and my channel. I really appreciate it.